My name's Carl Rhodes. I'm the Dean here at UTS Business School, and I'd very much like to welcome you here to the school. I will begin, as is tradition and as is very important, to acknowledge that we're here on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay respects to their elders and ancestors. And also, very importantly, to acknowledge their ongoing status as the first peoples of this land. Now, as you may know, the Gadigal people have cared for their community, land and waters for thousands of generations based on a deep knowledge of the country. Now, given the issues that will be discussed here this evening, it's important to remember there was no climate change in Australia before 1788. The relationship of people to the land in Australia changed fundamentally with colonialism, where the land became seen as property and as a resource to be exploited for personal gain. And the industrialization that came later exacerbated this lack of care, leading to the crisis that we have today. And in a sense, it's worth acknowledging, as we acknowledge country today, that climate change is a white fella's problem. And one where a return to care for the land is needed. Now, here at UTS Business School, we strive to be a socially committed business school focused on developing and sharing knowledge for an innovative, sustainable and prosperous economy in a fairer world. And it's in that spirit that we welcome you here this evening. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Andrew Parfitt, the Vice-Chancellor here at the University of Technology, Sydney, who will introduce this evening's event and our distinguished guest speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl. And look, it's great to see so many people out on a cold night like this for the continuation, I think, of a really important dialogue around the issues that are facing us, the big issues. Let me also acknowledge that we're on Gadigal land. This has always been Gadigal land, and pay respects to elders past and present. And also reinforce Carl's comment that working with and for First Nations people has so many benefits for the future of our country, not only in terms of the environment and the land itself, but in terms of the social structures, the way in which we behave towards one another, the way in which we face the future with a confidence that embraces all of us in shaping that future that we all want to see. So it's terrific to see you all here for another conversation around some of those key issues. Also like to acknowledge that the event is co-sponsored by the Australia Institute and welcome Richard Dennis to us tonight. These sorts of things don't happen by accident. They take quite a lot of work, and thank you to those who've put the effort in to bring us together. And Professor Stiglitz, again, welcome back. In actual fact, a couple of years ago now, speaking at the Vice-Chancellor's Democracy Forum around the issue of the post-pandemic recovery and the economic structures that underpin that. We have a series here that we call the Vice-Chancellor's Democracy Forum. This might seem like a strange name, except when you consider how important the fundamentals that underpin a democratic, fair, open society are. It's not a fuzzy concept. It's a concept that has to be underpinned by the social structures, the political structures, and the economic structures that drive what we do. Because without all of those working together, some of the great challenges that we have to face can't be addressed. So we have to take this from the perspective that if we want to have a society that's shaped by the values that we hold important, we have to understand the workings of how that plays out. And we've heard before Professor Stiglitz is leading us in the debate around some of these very factors that are important for how we do proactively and actively address the issues that face us. And what bigger issue that we have at the moment in many ways than climate change? Climate change in the sense that we know the science behind it, the science is there. The question is, what do we do? And what do we do and how do we do it and what are the ways in which we do it by maintaining a society that is prosperous, healthy, and that the economic underpinnings of our addressing climate change also support the future that we want to see as a community. These are complex issues. They're issues that need to be debated openly and discussed openly. And I hope tonight will give you an opportunity to do that, to be challenged by some ideas. Ideas are important in this space because without the openness that we have, and that's what university communities do, without the openness to put ideas on the table, challenge them, pull them apart, put them back together again, then we won't find practical solutions that lead to an outcome. So it's great to see everybody here. Great to have you here, Professor Stiglitz. And I'll just say a few words now about Professor Stiglitz. Of course, many of you don't need to have this introduction, but I'll do it anyway. Sorry. Professor Stiglitz is an American economist and a professor at Columbia University. He's also the co-chair of the high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress at the OECD and the chief economist of the Roosevelt Institute. And if somebody is in a position to take us through a conversation around the big issues of the world, it's Professor Stiglitz. He was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2001 and the John Bates Clark Medal in 1979. He's a former senior vice president and chief economist of the World Bank and a former chair of the US Council of Economic Advisors, the author of numerous books, and in 2011 was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. He's joined here by our own Professor Cathy Walsh, who's Associate Dean in this business school. She leads the program of research that takes place here, and she'll engage in a conversation with Professor Stiglitz after his presentation. So we're really looking forward to this. Welcome back, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, and really appreciate everyone coming out today for what's going to be an enlightening and thought-provoking discussion about something really important to everyone. It should be important for everyone in Australia, this issue of inequality. Before we start, can I just ask you to turn your phones off? Not off completely because we need it for Mentimeter, but make sure they're on silent. We will be giving Professor Stiglitz the floor for the first section of this so he can sort of have an uninterrupted chance to tell us all of his thought-provoking views. So during this time, if you do have any burning questions, can you pop them into the Mentimeter? So if it's on the sides here, just menti.com, and that's the number underneath. Pop your numbers in there. We probably won't get to all the questions, but I'll try and moderate them and get the sense of the room to come through in the moderated questions that I'll pose on your behalf at the end of this. So once again, thank you very much for joining us, and I'd like you to put your hands together for Professor Joseph Stiglitz.
So the subject of the discussion today is as it's on the slide there, is modern industrial policy. And maybe I should clarify, industrial policy doesn't necessarily mean industry, even though the name would seem to be. It's really the role of government in affecting the sectoral allocation of production, affecting the choice of technology, or even in, and most importantly, in the promotion of innovation in one area of technology or another. So it's a very broad concept about, do you just leave it to the market, or do you have government intervention to try to move the economy in one way or another? For a very long time, the conventional wisdom was that government shouldn't do that. You should leave it to the market. And that notion was encapsulated by Mike Boskin, who was the predecessor of one of my predecessors as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. He was the chairman under the first President Bush. And he said it didn't make any difference whether an economy produced potato chips or computer chips. Just leave it to the market. And obviously that view is no longer accepted in the United States. Europe is moving in that way, and Australia has a program moving where government is intervening. In the context of the United States, we've entered into this in a massive way with two important bills, one called the CHIPS and Science Act, where in response to the realization that we are totally dependent on the chips coming from Taiwan, and with President Xi in China saying there's going to be a reunification with China, maybe peaceful, but maybe not. But there will be a reunification, and the only debate is how soon that will occur. America has begun to feel a little bit insecure since all our chips come from Taiwan and our whole economy is dependent on chips. If we don't do something to develop our own chip production, we are extraordinarily vulnerable. A second reason, a second act that we passed was this was a relatively small bill, about $250 billion. But the more significant bill was the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act. It had very little to do with inflation, other than getting Manchin on board to support it. So that, in that sense, inflation was important. And it did have some provisions about reducing healthcare costs, but it was mostly a green bill. It was America had denied under Trump the existence of climate change, and we were falling behind. And the strong view was of the Democrats, the Biden administration, is that we ought to get on board. And this was our attempt to do that, to push the green transition. That was a bigger bill, originally estimated like $300 billion, $350 billion, but it was in the form of tax credits. And when you do tax credits, you really don't know how big of a bill you have, because it depends on how many companies take up your offer to get tax credits if they do what you are providing the tax credit for. And it is now estimated that they made a little mistake. It's between $1 trillion and $1.5 trillion dollars, which that's a lot of money, no matter where you come from. So this is a very big bill to push the U.S. along the green transition and develop new green technologies. There's a third concern that we've not done anything about, but is except talk a lot about it, is a recognition that the American economy showed itself not to be very resilient in the pandemic and the war, Russian invasion of Ukraine. We wound up with a large number of shortages, and after that, we started realizing what would happen if. And we realized that the market, it really doesn't handle shortages very well. And we realized, we began to, when I say we, a lot of policymakers began to realize that the basic business model of the economy may have been good for individual firms, but was not good for the economy. And an example of this was just-in-time inventory. And just-in-time inventory has some big advantages in terms of saving an inventory costs and this is a business school, and exposing defects in production. But on the other hand, when you have a big interruption and a big shock like the pandemic, the whole production structure collapses. A depends on B, B depends on C, C depends on A, and none of them have any inventories, and the whole system collapsed inward. So those are production externalities that are not well priced, and the market solution to that was inadequate. And there's a recognition that among all the advanced countries that there's a need for creating a more resilient economy. So that has been the basis of a bipartisan view about the need for industrial policy. And when I say bipartisan, Biden has been the first president to successfully implement a reasoned industrial policy. But on the Republican side, Senator Rubio, one of the leading, has written papers that look like they were cribbed from me. I mean, they are enthusiastic about industrial policy. So it is really a bipartisan. Some somewhat different arguments, and I'll come to that later, about what industrial policy is supposed to do. But the fact that the government ought to take a larger role in directing the economy, sectoral allocation, is now on the part of both major parties. There's still a group in the middle, particularly neoliberals, quickly, hopefully, a rapidly extinct species of human being, but still alive and well in Productivity Commission in Australia and certain other places, the Reserve Bank of Australia and Federal Reserve, and so they're not quite extinct, but it's becoming a rarer species. They don't have any political home right now in the United States. But before getting into my discussion of trying to articulate what is behind this, I want to emphasize that while people like Mike Boskin might have said that it doesn't matter whether you should produce potato chips or computer chips, they excoriated industrial policy. The United States has had industrial policy for 170 years and continue to have industrial policies even in the period when we were telling other countries not to have industrial policies. You might say the industrial policy in the United States began in the very beginning with Alexander Hamilton. And the first national bank in the United States was created right after the creation of the United States, which Hamilton said was to help industrialize the United States. The U.S. government was providing credit to help create industry and moving the United States away from agriculture into commerce and industry. So it's been there from the very beginning. The really big entry into industrial policy was in 1863 when we passed the Morrill Act. The major industry in the United States at the time was agriculture. It was about 70% of the economy, directly and indirectly. And we passed a bill that said the government would provide for agricultural extension, research. It was the basis of the founding of, our universities are called A&Ms, Agriculture and Mining universities, and Texas A&M, Iowa, all the state universities were founded by the U.S. government in 1863, or that was the bill. And it was a industrial policy bill. Industry then was promoting agriculture, recognizing that there was insufficient research privately going on, and that was a collective good that needed to be advanced. And they created extension services not only to do so they not only did the research, they took it on as a government responsibility to translate that research to every farmer in the country. It was a really big undertaking because these are small enterprises. More recently, if you look at the United States, the sectors where we excel, like high-tech pharmaceuticals, they're all based on U.S. government financed research. The first browser, the internet, all the basic research of the drugs, including the mRNA platform that led to the vaccine that has played such an important role in enabling us to be here today. All of that was government funding. Much of the industrial policy of the United States, though, for a long period during the period where industrial policy was not acceptable, was done secretly in the Defense Department. So it was called defense policy, but it was industrial policy. And, they did a lot of good research in the Defense Department. And then that became part of the industrial advantage, comparative advantage of the United States. I sometimes think that the reason the United States told other countries not to do industrial policy was because it gave us a big competitive advantage. You don't do what we do, and we'll do it secretly, and we'll be number one. And then we can say, well, we're so much smarter than you are. So what I want to emphasize is that U.S. industrial policy was very, very successful. And when I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, this was a while ago, but we did a calculation of the rates of return that we had gotten on our investments in R&D, and they were much higher than returns in the private sector, in R&D, returns in infrastructure, returns in any other area in the private sector. So that our industrial policy were actually really good investments. And, I should say, not every project was successful, but if every project were successful, it would be evidence that we weren't undertaking enough risk. That if you undertake risk, and when you're doing R&D particularly, that was what part of our industrial policy was R&D, you expect to have failures. And, every research project is into the unknown, and if you knew it was going to be a success, it wouldn't be a research project. So, but the average returns were very high. We made some mistakes almost systematically, but they were mistakes more in the design of contracts than they were in identifying good projects. So I've noticed as I walked, gone around Sydney, there are a lot of Tesla cars. Elon Musk likes to claim credit for Tesla. But I don't know if you know that the U.S. government put in almost $500 million into his company, and if it hadn't put that money in, the company would have gone bankrupt. But like many of the cases where we make a mistake, we take the downside risk, but we don't take up the upside potential. So the U.S. government would be very wealthy instead of Musk being wealthy if we had designed the right contract so that we got the upside potential. So he walked away with the profits, and we took the downside risk. As I look at the IRA and the CHIPS Act, they're not perfect. If they'd asked me to write the bills, I could have done a much better job. But if I had written the bills, they never would have gotten passed. To get them passed, you need a political compromise. That's the reality. And I still believe, if you look net, both of them are very, very much positive. So I'm going to spend a few minutes now talking about 4 aspects of our thinking about modern industrial policy, which make it different from the industrial policies of the past. And let me say, I talked about the United States, Japan, China, most of East Asian countries have had very successful industrial policies. Again, not perfect, but it has been the basis of the East Asia miracle. But industrial policies are today a little bit different from what they were 30 years ago. And so what I want to do is to spend just a few minutes going through some of the key changes. The first is that we have today, I think, a better understanding of market failures, why you can't just leave it to the market. In some cases, it's obvious the market can't deal with a massive externality like climate change. But more broadly, whenever you have innovation, markets don't work well. It's a sort of ironic because a lot of people think that innovation is really one of the great achievements of the market economy. And it is, but the theorems that say that markets are efficient, the Arrow-Debreu theorems, assume no technological change. Or if there is technical change, it's exogenous, it's not endogenous. But once you incorporate endogenous technical change, markets are not, in general, efficient. And in some ways, it should be obvious when you start thinking about it. If you look around, we have scarce research resources. And if you asked, what are our societal priorities? We're devoting an enormous amount of research to create machines to replace human beings, especially unskilled workers. We have enough unskilled worker unemployment. I don't see the need for more unskilled worker unemployment. But the market seems to think it's a good thing to have more people unemployed. And so they're working very hard. We're putting an enormous amount of our research resources to create more unskilled labor unemployment. On the other hand, if I were to say what is the most important thing for research, I would say it's saving the planet for climate change. So if I were redirecting resources, I would say, let's move it away from creating more unemployment to saving the planet. Now, that's a no-brainer, I think. And yet, the market doesn't seem to understand this. And I've given lots of lectures, and so they have access to all the information I've written about it, and they still don't seem to change their behavior after all these lectures. There are some fundamental problems of incentives. And, I've explicated that. It's not, but it should be obvious that markets don't produce the right kind of innovation, and there are lots of other problems in the innovation process. This in turn has some fundamental problems about the structure, not only of domestic government policy, but international policy that I'll come back to a little bit later. But the WTO, our rules-based international regime, was really based on neoliberal orthodoxy, which assumed, like neoliberalism, that there was no such thing as endogenous technological change. So they prescribed government subsidies for the most part, except for agriculture. So while it was really important to subsidize innovation in climate, they made it more difficult. And when China went ahead and spent some money on getting the price of solar panels way down, what did the United States, under WTO rules, do? It imposed tariffs to increase the cost of solar panels so that we don't engage in renewable energy. I mean, it's almost mind-boggling that we're doing this. But this is the international architecture, which was designed with a theory that ignored the endogeneity of technical change and the role that government policy could play in structuring innovation in a socially productive way. The second thing, I want to move a little faster. Okay, the second thing is today industrial policy has many more objectives. In the beginning, if you went back a couple of centuries, it was all about competition. It was about, and that's really where Trump is. It's making, and the Republicans, it's making our country more competitive vis-a-vis other countries. But even, my argument would be, it would be desirable for us to have industrial policy, even if we were sitting here in isolation, because the market won't have enough climate policy, won't deal adequately with either positive or negative externalities. With the problems of imperfect capital markets, imperfect risk markets, all the sources of market failures that the research of the last 40 years has expounded. So another aspect of industrial policy, and we're trying to incorporate some of this into, it was incorporated in the CHIPS Act, and workers are, as I say, we need more labor-intensive production. We need better working conditions for workers. And so you can have industrial policies that try to promote these objectives incorporated as you advance other objectives. The third thing about modern industrial policy is that it engages in many more instruments. Old industrial policy focused on tariffs, protection, on even today we focus excessively on tax credits, but there are many other instruments like loans. One of the important institutional frameworks for industrial policy are development banks. That long-term horizon, the World Bank is an example, but we've created in New York State a green development bank to promote the green transition in New York State. And part of the IRA was a provision for creating a national green bank. It's just started and it's relatively small, but the idea that you would create a green bank is an important institutional instrument for advancing industrial policy. Prices, like a carbon price, regulation, like requiring fuel efficiency, are other instruments that are important. Procurement, government procurement can be a very important instrument of industrial policy. And then, fourthly, we've learned from both the successes and the failures of industrial policy that we can design, and it's important that we do that, design better industrial policies. And what do I mean by that? Well, one aspect of a better industrial policy is better contracts. So with Elon Musk, we would have taken some more of the upside, making sure that there's more skin in the game so that people don't just take advantage of the government, that if things don't work out, they lose something. Better rules for termination so that you have a review process. And when the things aren't working out, you bring it to an end. Trying to design better institutions that immunize better industrial policy from political influence. You never do that perfectly, but you can do, there are institutions that do it better. And you know, selecting research grants for universities is an example where we've, I think, done a pretty good job of insulating selection processes from government influence. And I think one can do the same in industrial policies. So those are examples of better design. The final thing I want to raise is what I view as one of the big challenges, one of the big problems with industrial policies today, and that is the implications for the rules-based international trading system. The basis of that system is to try to create a level playing field. And that was why subsidies were proscribed. A lot of the provisions that basically have been associated with trying to create a level playing field. Well, several things have happened in recent years. One of them, background, is that the WTO appellate court, which decides whether things are legitimate or not legitimate, has been hamstrung by the U.S. government. We have not allowed appointment of new judges to the WTO appellate court, so now there are not enough judges to constitute a court, and the court has not functioned for years. And that means there is no way, there's no court system to enforce violation of the WTO rules. Then, after the United States dismantled effectively, unilaterally, the WTO appellate court system, it flagrantly violated the rules. One of the rules are no industrial subsidies. It's a rule I think was a badly designed rule, because I think you ought to have subsidies for climate change. But we violated it in a number of different ways, and we said we will continue to violate until the rules get reformed, including the rules governing the court. And basically the view the U.S. has taken is any court that can rule against the United States is defective. So we like courts as long as we can be guaranteed that they rule the right way. Well, the other countries in the world are not so enthusiastic about this particular interpretation of this agenda. And so, not surprisingly, there's not been a reform of the court. We are very unhappy with that. We say it's up to the WTO to reform, and all they have to do is agree with us, and the reform will happen. And we don't understand what the problem is. So,
any color they want, as long as it's black.
yeah. So that's where we are right now. So the U.S. has violated the rules. There is no court system to discipline the United States. The United States says it will continue to violate the rules unless there's a reform, until there's a reform. This is coming from effectively from the head of the National Security Council. In a speech he gave at Brookings, he didn't quite say it quite as forcefully as I just put it, but effectively that's what he says. And so we have an unlevel playing field. And we have a rules-based system where the rules have to be obeyed by poor countries, like when they tried to get drugs in the pandemic, the vaccine, they said, if you do that, we're going to beat you up because that's a violation. You're violating intellectual property rights. But when the U.S. violates the rules, nothing happens. So you can imagine there's some discontent with the rules-based international order, trading system. And in this area of industrial policy, Europe is complaining that they can't compete with the United States. They don't have the fiscal resources. It's a self-imposed discipline because they're still neoliberals in Europe. But the developing countries and emerging markets clearly don't have the financial resources to compete. So we have this very a world unraveling in a way. The post-World War II architecture is being challenged by this new modern industrial policy. I proposed some ways that we can help address the issues in terms of sharing technology, providing money to help the emerging markets. So I think there are some solutions. It won't happen under Trump. There's some hope it might happen if the Democrats get elected. And so let me, with that remark, open it up for discussion.
I can't believe you left me on a Trump question at the very end. That could be quite dangerous. Thank you. That was extraordinary. I really appreciated your insights there. You sort of finished up on this issue of inequality, so I might sort of delve into this a little bit more at a local level for us. Carl mentioned that, we didn't have climate change in Australia until we invaded and took away the land of the Gadigal people. We have real inequality in our First Nations people in Australia. We're trying really hard to have Indigenous-led policies to try and solve this. But when you take those sort of approaches where you want to have more government intervention to make it work, how do you make it work with something as sensitive as First Nations people in a particular country?
Well, first I would say, even though they may not have contributed or responsible for climate change, they are going to be affected by it. And so it's a responsibility of government both to make sure that climate change is put under control as much as possible, and that there are resources for adaptation to help them respond to the climate change that will occur. And they are often, the poorest are most affected globally because they live in something often put into the poorest places, or they can only afford to live in the places that are most affected by climate change.
That's an important point because, like, we look at the remote areas of Australia where we have very low employment opportunities for Indigenous peoples, and that's the area that climate change is going to be hitting quite hard. So
that's right, and the United States, we pushed our First Nation into places in the country where no one wanted to live, deserts, and so some of them were lucky and there was oil underneath the land. But most of them were not so lucky. So that's an area where we have to really help in adaptation. But as I say, there has to be a commitment to do what we can to stop climate change.
yes, so that's where the government intervention starts with before we even move forward. Can I just move? I've got a lot of questions, so I'm not going to get to them all. I'm just trying to sort of group them a little bit. You've touched on the area of sort of international cooperation and the need to collectively solve some of these problems. But, you know, with the WTO, for example, we've got some imbalances and some inequalities going on there. In sort of current areas of geopolitical instabilities and the tensions, like, what are the chances of actually affecting real and lasting change here? I mean, how much of those geopolitical tensions going to affect how we move forward?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of uncertainty about that, but there are two scenarios. There are a couple of scenarios where I think things might work out well, sometimes for the wrong reason. One of them is there is a new Cold War. That's clear part of the environment that with China, and competition for the hearts and minds of those in the third world could lead to efforts to help them to transfer resources and technology in ways that the gap that I described doesn't get larger. So that's one possibility, that the fact that we are engaged in that battle will have positive outcomes. Unfortunately, so far, we've been losing that war and we haven't been paying much attention to.
No, and I think that the risk aversion and the nervousness means that there's lack of engagement rather than working together to try and find solutions.
That's right. And particularly on climate change, and this is where there's a big difference between Biden, Harris, and the Democrats and the Republicans. The Democrats, even though they have a, you might say, anti-China policy, mute that sentiment because they know that they need cooperation with China on climate change and pandemics and other areas. So the belief of the Democratic administrations has been that we can compete fiercely and in some cases nastily in many areas, and then work together in a very friendly way in areas like climate change where we have a common interest. Many people in China have expressed the view that that's not how things go. We've, I'd say, had the view that it's so much in the interest of China, in the self-interest of China, to cooperate in these areas, that even though they might resent our belligerence, in the end, their self-interest in cooperation will overcome that. So that's where the debate is
absolutely. And I think that we have very different approaches to how we do business, and that separation of church and state is quite different, obviously, in both countries. But moving ahead, it's, trying to cooperate, even if you have different mindsets, is an interesting perception.
Yep.
So, just moving forward, I've got... How do we wean the New South Wales economy off coal royalties? We're in a climate crisis, yet there are about 14 coal mine expansions under assessments in New South Wales, and the biggest will create 1.16 gigatons of CO2.
Well, I just think you should shut down your coal industry. I don't think that's...
I think you're preaching to the converted
to
here.
me, I look at this, I don't think it's very complicated.
Yeah.
You look at, there are two aspects of this. One is employment. There aren't many jobs in coal mining. And, you know, in the whole process, it's become very automated. I think Richard was telling me, I don't know, unofficial, you know, numbers are, there are more, I forget what it was. What? Dog groomers than there are coal miners. In the United States, the example, you know, there are 5 times the number of people engaged in solar installation than there are coal miners. So it's just not an important industry, except for the profits that it generates. And those go to a few people, particularly the way you seem to manage your natural resources in Australia, which I don't understand. It's part of the political economy of Australia that I don't understand why you give away so much to so few. You know, so if a few of those coal miners, owners of those coal mines are a little bit, you know, they go from being multi-billionaires to being only billionaires, you know, my heart bleeds for them, but not that much. So it seems to me you should just shut down those coal mines.
That's a very good advice. One of the things we challenge ourselves with, though, is how we actually get the political will to do that when there's a lot of that money coming into how we operate our country.
Well, the question is, how much is going into how you operate the country? Very little. And you compare that to the damage, and that's a lot.
Yes.
And in some, you know, I haven't looked at the data, but I've been told that, for instance, in some of your, this is not coal, but natural gas and other fossil fuel, you subsidize it. You make a loss in that. You know, why you would pay people to take your natural gas, again, is one of those mysteries that I don't understand about Australia. I have only been here for a short while, so maybe after a couple of weeks I'll understand why you pay people to take away your natural gas.
Another peculiarity about the Australian economy is we have a very, well, I think quite an advanced retirement savings program through our superannuation. It's worth about $3.5 trillion in our superannuation in Australia because we have compulsory savings for retirement. Yet quite a considerable amount of superannuation funds seem to only play lip service when it comes to climate change and really don't invest in programs to understand what these climate risks are going to be and how they actually equate to financial risks. Do you have any advice on how we can actually think more long-term when it comes to this retirement savings? It should be aligned. Retirement savings and climate change should be something on the same sort of level of horizon.
Yeah, well, there are a couple of aspects of that. One of the things that we've succeeded in doing under the Securities and Exchange Commission in recent, under Gary Gensler, who Trump says he's going to replace, is requiring disclosure of climate risk and making it, you know, that when you invest in a company, or if it's dependent on fossil fuel, the value of that company may be wiped out once we recognize, which I think we eventually will, climate risk. So there's a very big risk of investing in any company that is dependent on coal or on fossil fuels. Also, by disclosing climate risk, you realize, this may be a good thing. No, let me take that off the record. Florida will be underwater with climate change. It's barely above water now. And, so the irony of Trump being in a place that will be underwater and saying we shouldn't do anything about climate change. There's a certain irony here. But again, disclosure that real estate will be underwater, what are the risks, is really important. So these disclosure requirements, I think, not only are important in recognizing risk, but also making people come to understand what climate change is likely to do for them in so many ways. Now, the point, coming back to the retirement funds, the superannuation funds, they're investing for the long term. A 30-year-old person is likely to be alive at 50 years from then, and Florida will be underwater in 50 years. Lots of it will be. If you're investing for 50 years, that's a risk they should be obligated to take into account. And unfortunately, Milton Friedman had a lot of negative effects on economic policy, and one of them was shareholder value maximization. One aspect of that is fiduciaries like retirement funds should only focus on maximizing the market value as of each moment of time, assuming that the market's looking infinitely far into the future in a rational way. They don't. We know markets are short-sighted, so they know they haven't fully taken into account some of these risks. And so I would put the obligation quite reversed. I would say you have an obligation as a retirement fund to think about the long run, to think about the possibility the market may have gotten this wrong, that what are climate risks? What would happen if there's a climate risk? And not only, both aspects, what we call transition risk and physical risk associated with climate change. So forcing the retirement funds to think about those effects, I think I would put,
And would that pressure come from regulation, or would that pressure come from shareholder activation?
No, I think it has to come from regulation. I think, these are fiduciaries, and fiduciaries are holding the money in trust for those people who are going to be retired in 50 years, and most of those don't know what the fund is investing in. And they don't. It's a public good to think about what is the architecture, the economic architecture, what they're doing, and so having public monitoring of that kind of accountability seems to be very important. I do know in the book I wrote with Linda Bilmes on the $3 trillion war, which is about the Iraq and Afghanistan war, we did discuss the extraordinary pollution associated, those war machines use an enormous amount of oil. So we documented there the amount of oil that was being used and how bad that was. But I don't know if there's been anything done at a global level.
One of the questions that just come through here is that taxes don't sell elections. We want to get to a situation where we can actually, have more regulation, but we face this when we're coming up to elections, that if you say that we want to regulate more, it's going to be hard to vote in. How do you actually get the populace to think about this in a more global way?
Well, that was one of the reasons I wrote my book, The Road to Freedom, Economics in the Good Society, because I wanted to change the debate, the discussion about the view of whether regulations reduce or increase freedom. An example I give that I hope helps increase understanding of this is stoplights, traffic lights. They say you can't go across an intersection until you get a green light. It's a kind of very simple regulation, not hard to implement, and you get fined if you do break that regulation. But if you didn't have that regulation in a place like New York or any large town, a large city, no one could move. You'd have gridlock. So actually, everybody has more freedom with a simple regulation. And a regulation against pollution allows us to live. And if you didn't have that regulation, you'd have, our cities would be polluted. We couldn't breathe, and some people would die.
Well, we had that, of course, with COVID, right? We had situations where in Australia, I think we generally embraced, a lot of us embraced the COVID restrictions that we had to have in place. But people from outside of Australia looked at us as a bit of a nanny state, that we were actually sort of succumbing to the wills of the government. I think most people in Australia appreciated the fact that very few people died compared to other nations, and most of the time, lined up to get their vaccinations, but we were considered sort of a bit of an outlier as far as that approach.
Yeah, so I think your approach was right, and again, that was why I wrote the book. I was trying to explain that there was a trade-off, your freedom not to wear a mask versus somebody else's freedom to live. And I said, which is more important, a little inconvenience of you're wearing a mask, or somebody's basic freedom to live? And it seemed to me that was a no-brainer.
Yes.
So hopefully we can try to explain that there are these, another example in the United States is the right to carry a gun. People, I think in every other country, the view that the freedom to carry a gun is less important than the freedom to live, and that and the freedom from fear. I mean, it's actually every kid in the United States, beginning in kindergarten, has to learn what to do if a gunman comes into your classroom. And you can imagine the fear of parents of whether their kid is going to be able to come home from school that day. But the fear of the kids, of what kind of climate does it create when at any day somebody can come in your classroom and shoot you up? So these are trade-offs, but I think these should be easy trade-offs for any civilized society to make.
Yeah, we've grasped in Australia, I think, especially with gun reform. We had a terrible incident many years ago where we reacted quite strongly to having guns in Australia, and we voluntarily, with some coercion, using your words, gave up the guns. Whereas if you ask anyone in the US, they say it's too far. We can't actually go back and wind back those rules anymore.
No, I don't think, I think we think that if we got a good Democratic administration, we could do that. Now, we have a problem with the Supreme Court. We have to change that. But the good news is the Constitution gives us scope to do that. Whether the Democrats will be brave enough to do it is another matter. But we don't have to change the Constitution to appoint more people to the Supreme Court.
And do you think that's likely in the coming years, or it depends on the...
I'm very hopeful because it's one of those things that the Supreme Court has been so political, so going beyond what I would call the law, and I think most lawyers think this. That it has become not only insensitive to the role of a Supreme Court in trying to bring a country together and to be fair in some ways, but it has actually gone out of its way to make decisions that would have been viewed in any law school as beyond the pale.
Yeah. And sort of almost a segue on from that, we think about sort of free markets with the, Adam Smith invisible hand, making sure everything works perfectly. And then you move across to, say, in China's situation at the moment, where a lot of the decisions are made by the state. So you would think a US sort of style of, complete freedom. In your book, you'd say that the freedoms of some shouldn't be, it's a zero-sum game, I suppose, that there's, if you take away the freedoms of, give more freedom to one group, then you're taking it away from another. When you move in China's situation, they're actually leading the efforts into decarbonisation, but it's actually restricting the freedom of its people in order to make these very state-based decisions. So does this example pose a challenge to the idea that freedom might actually eventually equal climate change? Climate action?
No, I mean, I think that in Europe, there is a very, very broad consensus that they have to take strong action to climate change. They're very democratic societies, and they've really bought into the notion that climate change is real and we have to take action. I think Australia would have bought into that if you didn't have such a large fossil fuel industry that has pushed against that idea. I haven't met any Australian on that other side, but maybe the Australian Institute doesn't have that many friends in the coal industry, so I haven't met them. Maybe they should do a better job of giving me a more diversified view of Australia. But I think, so I think China is doing a lot about it, partly because it has no choice. I mean, it's actually, I've been at meetings, the senior people responding to, there was one occasion where the premier interacted with he has one press conference a year, not very, and he was being berated by people questioning him and say, you haven't done enough about climate change, about pollution. And his response was, do you think that I don't live in the same atmosphere? I'm trying to do it. So there is a lot of political pressure. You wouldn't call it democratic pressure, but it is a kind of democracy. People are saying in China, we can't live with that kind of pollution. So they are partly responding to a demand. So I don't think it is, the authoritarianism of China, particularly under Xi, is obviously disturbing. But I don't see that link that you need authoritarianism to do something about climate change. I think democratic governments in Europe, and eventually we'll have a democratic government in the United States that will do something about it, and in other countries, yeah.
So they're doing it despite the situation rather than because of it. So
yeah, well, I think they are responding. They are not democratic, but they stay in power partly because they do listen to sometimes to their people, and this is one issue on which there is a lot of consensus in China that they have to do something.
So I want to move sort of topics a little bit. Like many countries, Australia actually is facing a very serious problem with the population being an ageing population with decreasing birth rates. So this ends up having some systemic sort of inequalities in the country, because we're going to get to a situation where only the privileged can afford aged care in the way that it needs. In your interpretation of so where would the interventions be for the government in order to make this a less of a systemic problem for the countries?
Standard economics, neoliberal economics, has no problem. Those families just need to borrow from the capital market, and old people should have been rational and anticipated that they were going to be old. And
have perfect foresight for how long they're going to live.
They assume that there are perfect annuity markets, perfect credit markets, and if you assume perfect rationality and perfect markets, then of course there's little need for government doing anything. But once you get away from those absurd assumptions, you wind up in a society where you need to do something. And I think countries, many countries realize that and have some programs. I don't think they've done enough. I think Australia has done your income contingent loan program for students, has solved one important problem that we haven't solved at all in the United States. And we have actually each of those stages. We're finally beginning to have pre-K. It's become in New York City has provided pre-K for everybody, but not in the country as a whole.
No.
And pre-K is really at about 4 years old, not 3 or 2 or 1. So we have a problem at every stage of life. And no wonder then there's a lot of stress in our society. And I think that stress has a lot to do with how a demagogue like Trump appears on the scene.
So I can't believe we started with Trump and now we're ending with Trump. So apologies for that. But thank you very much, Professor Stiglitz. Can we have a round of applause?